Well, welcome everyone to the fourth in a series of webinars by the PyroLife International Symposium towards an integrated fire management. We have 384 people registered today, so very happy that everyone is a part of this and welcome along. A good morning to a lot of folks from the US and North America who are coming in. Good afternoon, of course, to many in Europe. And a now happy tomorrow to folks in Australia who have registered. My name is Lucian Deaton. I work with the National Fire Protection Association on our wildfire management community engagement and our international outreach. I'm going to share some of the technical aspects of today's webinar with you, and then we have two great speakers for the next hour and a half. We'll have the two speakers, each will speak for half an hour. There will be a time about 15 minutes for questions after those presentations. The audio and visual is turned off for participants, but what you can do is at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. That's where we ask you to put your questions and not into the chat function because some of them can kind of get lost, but in that Q&A box, then we can take those and we'll prepare them for the speakers. During the session, please do those, and if it is easier to write them in your own language, that's just fine. We have the ability to translate it. The questions will be posed and answered in English, but if it's easier for you to write in your own language, we're happy for that, and we encourage it so that you can really get your question across. Diversity is very important to PyroLife as well, and we encourage young researchers, women, others to post your questions. Don't be shy about them being in the discussion. The presentations are being recorded. They'll be on the PyroLife YouTube channel, on the Symposium webpage, and on Twitter, that PyroLife Symposium hashtag we encourage you to use for comments, discussions that you have during this, and of course after, to keep the conversation going from what we'll hear today. I want to introduce the two speakers that we have this morning. Bertram Rooij is a registered landscape architect and senior researcher at Wageningen University in their environmental research department. He focuses on landscape-based adaptation, risk reduction, and regional development in a diverse portfolio of projects. He's also an active volunteer firefighter for over the past 15 years. So certainly thank you for your service there. The presentation that he'll be giving today is Enabling Landscapes, Appealing Narratives About Wildfires in Perspective. And then the second presentation that we'll have, and we're happy to have Fulco Ludwig with us this morning. He's a professor of water systems and global change group at Wageningen University as well, and has a background in climate impact modeling and data analysis and extensive field experience in Africa, Australia, the US, and Asia. And he'll be speaking on living with fire. What can we learn from the experiences in the water sector? So happy to hear from them both today, and want to introduce Bertram again and have him give his presentation. So thank you all.
Yes, thank you, Lucian, for your introduction and the opportunity also to speak during this webinar. Let's see, I will share my screen with you all. Work. Yeah. First, well, I'm going to talk about enabling landscapes and appealing narratives about wildfires in perspective. And well, you also already introduced me. I'm a landscape architect at first, and a senior researcher at Wageningen Environmental Research. So doing a lot of applied research. I was for over 4 years a team member of the National Program on Wildfires, and last but not least, I'm also a firefighter, so I'm also in the field when necessary. Let's start my presentation with the first notion. I think I have a lot of notions about future perspectives and especially how to connect. And the field I'm working in is all about the landscape, and in the landscape it all comes together. And you have different landscape with the more broad landscapes, and I think typical from the Netherlands, but also many other countries is we're like Victory Boogie Woogie. So everything is connected to everything in a quite small space. And talking about wildfires, we often talk about risk. So that's about talking about probability times effect. But we're really Dutch, so we see it also as an opportunity. It's also a word I will use quite frequently in the next half hour. So the interwoveness is also an opportunity. The story of today, I will also start with the narrative. So I will tell you a story. I hope you like it. If you don't like it or you have some comments, please do, because that's the learning objective also of today. I have 3 elements in my presentation, starting with nature-based solutions and new risk reduction concepts. But if you want to look forward, you also have to look backwards. So we'll start with some elements from delta management and our Dutch practice. So it will also link to the story of Fulco, but I will only tip it, and Fulco will go more into deep on that. Then the importance of integrated planning and landscape approach. And last but not least, the importance of a good narrative and ownership. So who's going to build those enabling landscapes? The common threads are the Dutch approach, the Netherlands in 2120. I will tell more about that in a few minutes, I guess. And the EU project PLACARD. We went into strategic narratives, and those elements will also come up in my presentation. So let's start with nature-based solutions and new concepts. You also always have to find the proper solution for the proper problem or the proper opportunity. Well, where did we come from? Well, God created the world, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. So we're quite familiar with living with floods. And in former days, it was really struggling with those floods. And in the end, we turned it also in an opportunity, so making an engineerable landscape. So the famous polders are an element of those opportunities. But it also was about making things possible in flood-prone areas. So if you look at the right, you see the flood-prone areas. That's a large amount of our country. And if you look at the left, you see the gross domestic product and the population density, and that also is in the flood-prone areas. So it matters. So there's a lot of at stake. So if you look at Wageningen, that's in the bottom, the red spot, where we come from. There's a small dike, and if that dike breach, you have 250,000 people affected and 27 billion euro potential damage. So it really matters. So we'll keep innovating and improving, and most of the time it was technical hard defense. So for instance, like this sea defense in Rotterdam. But still, we have to keep our eyes open. So 20 years ago, there was a situation in the Netherlands, and it was not from rising sea levels, but especially from the rivers that we forgot. So in that time, there were need for new concepts, and spatial planning was really a new opening. So normally we try to keep it all out, and now it was more adaptive. But it's not only about adaptive spatial planning, so in the middle, but if you look at the hard defense, so the prevention, but also the crisis and disaster management, it all happens in the same space, in the same landscape. So it's all about spatial planning, and that's already a notion. And in that time, it was not only about finding space, but also including and connecting different other functions. So not just trying to prevent and create adaptive space, but also how to include, for instance, in the left side, agriculture, in the middle, recreation, and on the right hand, the natural qualities. So it's really trying to connect those different functions also to give it a better value also in time. So that's the Dutch style. So it's about spatial innovation, taming the floods, don't fight it, live with water. And it's not only about rivers or coastal areas, but also in the backyard. So if you look at the urban areas, you see all the time we're looking at the spatial elements, how to deal with potential flood risks, and to build new landscapes. But wait, there's more. And if you look at the last 10 years, a drought is the biggest challenge in the land of water. So you see a Dutch graphic in the right angle, and it's the current shortage in precipitation in the Netherlands, and we're already above last year and the year before. There were already a record high drought in the Netherlands. So wildfire is also emerging in the Netherlands, but also in the wider northwestern Europe. And do we have the same strategy ready? So if you look at the broad strategy and the implementation of spatial strategies in the water strategy, do we also have the same strategy for wildfires? And the answer is, well, quietly, no. But still, stakes are still high. Not only if you look at the water side, but also if you look at the connection between natural areas and the different functions. So for instance, recreation, industries, living areas, and of course, infrastructure. So are we tackling the right things? Like the water issues, if you look at the wildfire issues, are we really looking at the crucial problem? Or should we dig deeper and go to the real problem? Are we dealing with a cause, or are we dealing with an effect? So where is the answer to build an enabling, safe landscape? So does it only safeguard, or are we creating new values and opportunities? There was an article of last year in the New York Times. The Dutch have solutions and the world is watching. And I think the most important sentence is, instead, it's an opportunity. And that's also something I want to take into account if you look at the wildfire issues. I think the most recent concept, so beside the three-layer risk concept of earlier days, now we really try to go back to the core of our landscape. So trying to find nature-based solutions, because they are, well, they're not only inspired and supported by nature, but I think the most important thing is they are more cost-effective. They really rely on the basis, and they combine the environmental, social, and economic benefits. But the big question is, how do you implement that? Because they are really complex. They depend on the context, so there is no standard solution. And I think that's also the power of these nature-based solutions, that you really have to deep into the context and try to connect to the different actors also in the field. So it's all about planning. Planning is bringing the future into the present, and that's more than reducing risks, and that's more than just focusing on existing problems, but it's really trying to envision the future and try to find coherent and appealing strategies. And the first exercise we did last year, it was a big exercise. We envisioned the Netherlands in 2120, and it was really hot here in the Netherlands when it came out. So it wasn't meant as a blueprint, but it was meant to feed the discussion, and we achieved that. And we tried to combine everything with everything in this this perspective, and that's also the strong point. So we put in our full sea area besides the land area, but we also try to make a combination between climate adaptation, circular economy, inclusive society, and that kind of things, because it all ends up in the same landscape again. And if you talk to me as a firefighter or somebody that is for numerous years already in the wildfire issues, it's perhaps strange that we included new urbanism. Let's see if you see my mouse. It's over here. We had a large band of future urbanism with more green. And the question is not, is that bad that we have more green? But it's better that we already envision also a future of living with fires and how to prevent that we have issues with fire in how we implement that. So it's all about integrated planning and the landscape approach, understanding the landscape where you're working in, not only the physical landscape, but also the social landscape, and try to connect that to a full vision that includes everything. As mentioned in the beginning of this year, in climate change increased the risk of wildfires, land planning should take the increasing risk in fire weather into account. And the biggest question is, how do we do that? Well, in a report from UNDP of 2004 already, it's best, the opportunities are best in a development context. So trying to make progress and to create enabling landscapes instead of just responding to sudden emergencies. You really have to go into different levels in society, and not only different levels in society, but also to try to connect different sectors and bridging the gap between the climate community and the disaster risk community, and also the spatial planning community, because they are, well, not really well connected yet. And strategy and process are equally important, of course. So it's like the scientists were looking back, the politicians are looking forward, but in a short term. And I think we really have to connect short term and long term and the intermediate in a full strategy. And it's not just about sectoral short-term problem solving, but to long-term added value. So if you look at climate impact, it impacts on nature, urban, energy, but impact is quite, well, like you can have a positive or a negative impact. I think we should focus on a positive impact, and we should link to different entry points. So you can start from biodiversity, because biodiversity is just like climate adaptation, one of the key issues that threatens our economy. So that could be your entry point, but it could also be food. And it's all, you can all connect it also to wildfires, for instance. So what did we learn from the Dutch approach, trying to combine everything with everything, and the delta planning, in which Foucault will also deepen more. It's about the value of a holistic and integral view. It's about integrated planning and a landscape approach, multi-level, multi-actor, multi-scale. So you really have to zoom in and zoom out. And you really have to have real participatory processes. And integrated planning should be more, so really linking and just not trying to staple it. And research by design helps, and I'm very happy that also in PyroLife research by design is included. So research by design is any kind of inquiry in which design is an essential part of the research process. So it's not just about drawing pictures or drawing plans, but it's really, it allows a more detailed and a general discussion. And it really helps in getting better insights. So it makes you understand, it brings together, and it makes it work. So we're trying also to have expressive and systematic tools. So really try to connect design and science and practice together. And planning should be more than this. So if you look at the focal point on how to prevent, you will end up with this kind of rough pictures. If you go more into deep and you have a local situation, this is an example from the Netherlands where they try also to find the compartmentation of natural areas, but they still miss the link towards outside, so to the agricultural areas and different stakeholders. So it's about finding shared interest and common grounds. This is a picture from Deloitte, so that's more business-like, but you can also use it for wildfire strategies. It's about envisioning your focus and especially about mobilizing. So constantly zooming out and in between the different skills. So from a regional, national perspective, a regional perspective, and a local perspective. And it's more than just focusing on natural areas or agricultural areas, but really about the connections. So research by design helps. It helps in make it spatially explicit. It builds strategies and implementation by connecting and working on different skills. It's one landscape, so we shouldn't focus on a single issue because then we miss things. And we really have to envision a structural future, so a really comprehensive strategy instead of different things that comes together limited. And I think the most important part comes now, and that's it's the story that takes the cake. Last few years we worked on the EU project on PLACARD, and the important element in that project was about bringing the climate adaptation community and the disaster risk community together. And what really helped was finding the correct narratives and how do you bring actors really in the driver's seat. So you have different narratives about climate change, and so that's already a wide variety about where to lay the inconvenient truth, where it all started with, like the negative narrative, or just neglecting it, like President Trump perhaps. So that's the overall narrative worldwide. And how can you build a strategic narrative together to cook an appealing story, and for who, and what should be that strategic narrative with what purpose? So welcome in Bistro Changer. It starts with common understanding. So, and it's more than just awareness. So trying to really link it to the personal world of persons, and that's not only the personal world of persons that inhabit the area, but also that deal with the different crucial elements that come together in the landscape. So, for instance, if you look at electricity, water availability, etc., and how it also links to for instance, other risks. So, if you look at wildfire, you also have a flood risk, like for instance, flash floods. So there are different elements that come together. So it's more than just creating awareness. And you have different narratives to tell. And you have to make, well, you can choose about which narrative you would like to tell. So for instance, if you want to tell about living with fire, that's an overall narrative. But you also have to have a flexible narrative that appeals all your different stakeholders. So sometimes you have to change in the genre. Sometimes you have to change in the plot. Who's the hero in the story, or are there more heroes? So you really have to build a flexible narrative. It's not just one narrative, and just like the image of the Netherlands in 2120, it's not a blueprint. It's a direction, and there are different routes that leads in the same direction. And the devil is in every detail. So I don't know if there are any spatial designers now online, but it took really a time to build also the map for the Netherlands in 2120, because, for instance, the use of the color, the style you use for your mapping, it's really crucial also in how you build your story, and how does it appeal to everybody. So to conclude, it's important to, again, to start with a shared vision instead of solving problems. It's based on a holistic view, and keep your eyes open. So try not to focus too much in the first place, but really have a broad view, zoom in and out. Try to connect different skills, so regional, local, national, but always stay connected. And talking about connection, it's really about connecting to the wider society via appealing stories that are flexible, that build on a common ground, but most of all create agents of change. So be positive and creative, and really build forwards on the landscape of the future. And that will be my presentation. So thank you for your attention, and let's see.
Bertram, thank you very much. Really great explanation of things. And I have to say, your quote that God created the world, but the Dutch created Netherlands, I thought was just wonderful. So, and there's a great lesson there in what was done with the flood issue and then how it relates to fire that PyroLife is looking at. There have been some questions that have come in, so I want to get right to them, and I want to encourage others. If you haven't asked a question, go into that Q&A box, post one, and we'll have some good time here to ask. Mario Tapia posted one and said, I know that the Netherlands has pledged to become, hang on, good. I know the Netherlands has pledged to become climate proof and water resilient by 2050. However, wildfires are not a part of the plan. And he had added that the plan currently tackles coastal pluvial floods, droughts, and heat stress. I was curious as to what you think can be done to bring wildfires into the spotlight in this Northwestern European region, in the Netherlands, and in the plan itself.
We have a big Delta plan and a different regional approach, but it was really focused on too much water. And finally, we had some very dry years, the last few years. And they're really building now a kind of construct or a basis also to try to build that kind of Delta plan also for drought and heat, so also for wildfires. And we're constantly posing that they should also include the same strategies for that. So if you look at wildfires, it really still limits on reducing, oppressing. This year we already had two very big fires in the Netherlands with a large effect, also in Corona times. That's really an extra tough job, but it still focuses too much on the natural areas itself. But there's a way forward.
Cool, thank you. Andy Elliott had posted in Bertram, he was saying that you're correct, that we should see the opportunities in climate change. You would also mention in your comments, don't fight water, live with it. And Andy asks, do you think the same is true of wildfires, saying don't fight wildfire, live with it? And what are the opportunities that you see from wildfire in getting that?
It's really about how are you going to structure the landscape? Like the article of the beginning of this year already mentioned, you can't prevent wildfires. They will happen. Sometimes I say just let them burn, but only let them burn if you're really sure that everything is safe. So it's really about how are you going to arrange your landscape on the different scales. When it burns safely. I think that's the most proper strategy to live with fire, and also to see, because if I look at the Dutch planning practice, there's a check on where are you going to build and what is the link with water, but there's no link in spatial planning policies about, okay, and I'm going to build in a natural area. Is that the best thing to do? And what should I do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Pooja had posted a question. Let me just read it first. What do you think about how heterogeneity, feedbacks, and external drivers can limit the development of more adaptive approaches to policy and management?
Well, it's always about cherished biodiversity. About cherished diversity, and I think heterogeneity is really important. So also that's what I also meant about go into the context. There's no same landscape everywhere, so there's no one strategy. And if you look at the external drivers, the development of more adaptive approaches. Sometimes what is at stake? So perhaps it's better to, well, I mentioned you have to have positive stories, but sometimes it's also good to go to a certain sector and say, okay, you're at risk. What are you going to do? Or what should we do? And how can we do it together? So also to find the real urgency. So if you look at the energy transition or infrastructure, that kind of things, has a bigger stake than just the natural areas that include fires.
Yeah, and you're talking about talking to different sectors, and Catherine has a great question. I think adds on to that. Um, could you describe some participatory processes from your experience in planning that were successful, and others that were not? Why do you think these experiences had different outcomes? So when you're talking those sectors and others, how did you see that? What processes worked, and what were some lessons from that?
Well, frankly, I don't think I have any participatory. Well, I had participatory projects that were tough, but they always succeed because you have to go open into your participatory process and really start from the beginning. So I think Foucault will also mention the delta planning in Bangladesh. My Bengal is very poor, but we managed there also to have a participatory process, which started with a common understanding, and then developing a vision, envisioning together. And that is really crucial in your participatory processes, and it doesn't depend on the topic, but you really have to have an open mind, and there are also some key rules in every participatory process. Try to add to each other instead of, well, that's not a good idea because blah, blah, blah. No, I really want to add on this. So it's really about, as I mentioned, creative, but also constructive.
Cool. Question about evacuation has come in. I think it's a very good lesson to learn from. Lazarus asks, when dealing with a large-scale crisis, in many cases, population evacuation is necessary, across all hazards. How do you plan for that, and how do you validate your plans?
Well, frankly, if I look at the water sector, it only came up somewhere in the 90s when we had the issues with the riverine floods, that there was a need for evacuation routes. So it popped up. But if you look at wildfires, for instance, well, there are some, I think Catalina, my colleague, can also fully agree on that. There are different areas in the Netherlands where we have a lot of recreational areas like campings and that kind of stuff. And if you look at the potential evacuation routes, they're really poor. So I think that's really a crucial element, and that's why I also mentioned that it was also a spatial question, how to arrange that and what kind of structure can you build. And most of the time it's the last post. So we start, well, trying to reduce the fire, and then, well, if we really want to build a regional vision, then it's okay. And the last part is, okay, and if the shit really hits the fan, where are we going?
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, in a lot of those evacuation plannings, often they'll say, where to leave from, how to get out of an area, but some don't say where to go to.
Yeah.
And it sounds like with that they're just looking at how to get people to leave an area, but not those larger considerations of what could that fire do, or what could that flood do about where they're going.
And is there a kind of phasing in the evacuations for instance, and a hierarchy in the different roads, or?
Yeah. That idea of living with water that you talked about in the presentation, Cameron Rodriguez asked, in the Netherlands, we can see many examples of what living with water looks like in reality. Are there any other countries or regions that you can think of that show examples of what living with fire looks like?
Really living with fires. Yeah, I was also thinking about it when I prepared the presentation. Like, okay, can I give already good examples of areas living with fire? I think that there are some good directions already in the southern of Europe. It's also a thing about scale. So if you look at Australia, or for instance America, and the way policies are arranged, that in the basis there are some elements, but there's not yet one country or area I would say, okay, there's a good example of living with fire.
Yeah, it's. I hopefully by the end of this process, and with the PhD students as well, I think they'll either stumble upon some or teach us all what they are, or what needs to be, which will be great. Diang Noor Sakinha asks, what do you think about living with fire in the tropical country? Is there any benefit or opportunity from the fire? I think kind of that kind of role of fire on the land and its natural,
Yeah.
ecology of it, and then how do you balance that probably against, development issues that don't want to see fire, of
Well,
course.
if you look at history and also at present situation, there are a lot of fires already started, for instance, for agriculture, and that's okay. As you know, well, I think that there could be benefits, but they really should fit into the area and how you have arranged them. So, because often you see that they start a fire and then it's getting out of hand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Marty Alexander asked, do you foresee the possibility of wide-scale wildfires in the Netherlands? And you talked about that because that transition of issue of having drought now in a country known for water. Unfortunately, nothing we can do about. Excuse me, wrong one. If so, what would be the scenarios? What is that sort of that great risk scenario, and what does it look like?
Yeah, as I mentioned, everything is connected to everything here in the Netherlands, so it's on a really small scale. So, if you look at the European scale or a worldwide scale, we have small dots of nature, but I don't want to think about the worst case scenario currently. If I see at the last two big fires this year, the one in the Pale took already like 2 months before they finally tackled it. And the other one, they already had to evacuate villages and that kind of things. And it was off season, so off the recreational season. Well.
Yeah, and that's an issue we even see in the U.S. I'm sure seen around the world, that it's perceived that if the fire is small, if the wildfire is small, then it must not be a big issue. But what you were just describing, those resources at risk, those recreational areas at risk, those villages that had to be evacuated, all that occurred because of a small fire.
Yeah.
So that they can have that risk. Do you know directly with that village that was evacuated, was it because of smoke coming into it, or was it because the fire was on the border between the village itself and where the fire was burning?
I think mainly due to the smoke.
Mm.
So, and I think it's also important to mention, if you look at the connections with infrastructure, if you look, for instance, the route between the main port of Antwerp and the Ruhr area in Germany, really important economic hotspots. It goes across areas that burn quite frequently. Sometimes they have to cut down the highway, and the economic impact is way high.
Yeah, because of that road. Ria Shah had a question, a build on to one earlier when we were talking about that idea of living with water and living with fire. She says, to add to the previous question, would you say that there are other countries or regions that do well with living with water? The Netherlands obviously is one. Are there others that give examples there as well that can play to this PyroLife effort?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think it's also a good link to Fulco. I think Bangladesh is really a good example. They really had the Delta plan, a big plan on how to live with water and not just trying to survive, but also to build enabling landscapes and try to envision the future. That's a good example. And I think that there are different areas around the world that really try to connect also to the natural resources, the natural bases, and build on it to do that. Because if I look back to the Bangladesh, the first time when you come there and they say, well, no, I was in Argentina, and the first time we came there, it was, oh, you're really good in dikes, and we said, well, we're not going to do that here. So it's also an eye opener if they see what other opportunities there are in how to deal with your landscape and potential risks.
Yeah, very good. And one of the comments that came in from Edwin Koch, he said it was speaking of that the town that had to be evacuated. He said it was definitely due to smoke and carbon monoxide values in the city of Herkenbosch,
Yeah.
where the evacuation was. So, and that becomes an issue of, you can be further from the fire, but the smoke impact becomes very strong. Great example from the U.S. was out of Montana 2 years ago. They were having to evacuate cities because of what were otherwise natural fires burning in grazing lands. One last question here, and then we'll move to Fulco. Pooja asks, is it right to say landscape identity can be utilized as a central concept for engaging with social aspects of the impact of forest fire?
I would say yes, a big yes.
Very good.
So there's not
And
question.
yeah, no, you're good. And actually, we'll sneak one in here quickly before we go to Foco, because it was a good short answer. Simona Dossi asks, is there good collaboration between firefighters and academic fire researchers in the Netherlands and Europe? I suppose yourself is one, but you can see if there's others. What opportunities do you think there are for more collaboration between this academic research community and of course, the firefighting community?
Yeah. Well, we work closely with the Dutch Fire Brigade and also the Institute for Physical Safety. So Edwin Kok, who pointed the answer on Herkenbos, is one of those colleagues. I think that the most important thing is also to have the evidence base correct, and that's something we really should connect together, and how to build with that evidence base to really clear concepts.
Very good. All right. Yeah, I want to thank you very much for the peppering of questions that have occurred over the past 15 minutes to you. I know the audience has appreciated learning from you as well through this.